here, and we will allow others in. And Miss Love, I'm just going to mute you for now because I'm going to do a little bit of introduction, and then I will introduce you, and I will remember to unmute you and then bring you in. How does that sound? Okay. Good morning, all. We are going to get started here in just a minute. I love seeing these familiar faces. I'm just going to see how that's showing up on the live stream. Great. So I currently have my image pinned. That means that those of you joining on Zoom, the live stream cannot see your video or your name. So just so that you're aware, your privacy is protected in that way. If you want to at any point type anything into the chat, you can do so. I'll use your first name if I refer to you, but I won't use any last names. If you would rather just me use an initial or a nickname, you can rename yourself on Zoom to reflect how you'd like me to refer to you. And I'm going to get started here in just another couple of minutes. And I'm gonna have a special guest joining me after I do the introductions. But it's lovely to see some familiar faces. It's always interesting doing things online when we know each other through Facebook, or we just know each other through Instagram or other online interactions. And then to be like, oh, wow, like you're a real person. Like this is how your face moves. This is what your voice sounds like. There's a kind of excitement that I recognize I'm feeling in my body about that today. Okay, my clock says it's the top of the hour. So I am going to start the recording here. So happy solo polyamory day, one and all. My name is Mel, and I am live streaming today from the unceded territories of the Comox Nation on so-called Vancouver Island. These are the traditional territories of the Comox, Pentlak, Comalco, Wewekai, Wewekam, and Tla'amin peoples. And there have been inhabitants in this part of the world for over 10,000 years. Caretaking this land, and I am very honored to be a visitor on these lands. For myself, I am queer, I am a relationship anarchist, and I practice solo polyamory. I use they, them pronouns. I'm what I call a second generation third culture kid with a mixed background that includes being part of the Sinti Roma diaspora. I'm also part Greek, part Irish, part English. I've grew up in the Middle East, and now I live here on these colonial lands known as Canada. And I'm one of the co-founders of the Solo Polyamory Facebook group. And I'm really excited that this year I get the day off on Solo Polyamory Day and that I get to do this. It felt like it would be a really fun way to just celebrate what this community is, and all the wonderful things that have come together because of this community. I'm going to bring in a guest here in just a moment, but I was thinking last night, I was reflecting on what community is and how the Solo Polyamory group came to be. And, my journey in non-monogamy, I mean, it started when I was a kid. Let's be honest. As a teenager, I was not interested in monogamy, but it took me a while to find a word for what I was looking for. And it started in earnest in 2011 when I separated from my then husband. And it took me a while to figure out what I wanted. And in the polyamorous world that I entered into, everything was about you're either part of a couple or looking to be part of a couple, or you only date as a so-called secondary partner. And I wasn't looking to find a primary. I had just come out of a long-term, very primary-like relationship that had not worked for me in the least. And I decided that I wanted to be my own primary partner. And since I didn't see anybody writing about that, I started writing about it in my blog, Polysinglish. And as sometimes happens, the universe kind of, things trend at the same time. There's that phenomenon of like multiple scientists around the world are doing the same study and come to the same conclusion simultaneously. Well, in a similar way, at the same time, Aggie was starting her blog, Solo Poly. And so, and I think we actually started in the same month in 2012. And so there was this lovely kind of energy around people starting to articulate more about what solo polyamory was and also what it wasn't. And I started reading Aggie's blog, and I was using the social media network formerly known as Twitter. This was probably one of the only times I ever used Twitter. I tweeted at Aggie and I was like, there's got to be more than just us. There's got to be more than just you and me who want to do things this way, who don't want to be on that relationship escalator, who don't want primary partnership. And wouldn't it be cool if we could get together and have a space where we could talk about what that means and share about the issues and discover what other values we have in common? And so, lo and behold, we created a Facebook group. Now, that first Facebook group went defunct for various reasons, which I won't go into right now. But Aggie has a wonderful write-up on the solopoly.net blog about what happened. And in short, one of the moderators of that group went rogue and kicked the rest of us out. And so we just decided, well, I guess we'll start again. We had like 3,500 members in that group. And we're like, well, okay, we'll start again a year later. Fine. And so September 24th, 2014 is when we restarted the Solo Polyamory group. And that's why today is celebrated as Solo Polyamory Day, because who decides these things? I don't know. You just make a meme, throw it out on the internet, and it happens to, become a thing that gets celebrated. So that's why we're here today. And that rebuilt Solo Polyamory group now has over 13,000 people from around the world. And we've had, I think, three in-person Solo Polyamory unconferences. And then the last one, which was scheduled to be in New York in 2020, for obvious reasons, didn't happen. So it happened online instead. And it was Kelly who put that together. And there have been so many incredible individuals involved in organizing these unconferences through the years. And, one of the things that I think has been so interesting in the unconferences is exploring not just the values that we as solo polyamorous have in common, but also the ways in which we are different. And I think that's one of the really interesting aspects of community, is that community is often founded on our common values. So as solo polyamorous, what do we have in common? We don't want to be on the relationship escalator. We don't want to get in mesh with our partners in that way. For many of us, that means not nesting. For some of us, that means nesting and de-enmeshing at the same time. And there's a lot of people who I think have been inspired by those values, who've been drawn into the solo polyamory community, even if solo polyamory doesn't quite describe how they practice their non-monogamy. But all the differences that we have, I think, enrich who we are as a community. There's so many different approaches to commitment, to navigating hierarchy, even to how we define all the different aspects of solo polyamory. And I think something that this community in particular has been really good at doing is creating a space that is not just tolerant of those differences, but is curious about those differences. When I look at the discussions in the Solo Polyamory Facebook group, what I see so often is a curiosity about what's happening for other people, and then a lot of compassion, so much compassion and support. And I think this is one of the things that makes the practice of solo polyamory possible, is that you're not alone in this. You're not isolated, that you may not have a primary partner other than yourself if you choose to identify as your own primary, but you have community. And you have a community of people, 13,000 people around the world, who understand a part of your experience. You understand what it is to be independent, to be autonomous, to date as a solo person in the non-monogamous world, and all of the many things that we come up against. So we're going to explore that experience today. And for those of you who are joining us on Zoom, I would love for you to pop into the group chat and just say hi, tell us where you are joining us from. I know some of you are going to be coming in and out during the day. That's great. As I said, as we were getting started, you can rename yourself on Zoom, name yourself to however you'd like me to refer you to you. Your pictures are not visible on the live stream, so your privacy is protected that way. For those of you joining on YouTube, I will be checking the live stream comments every so often. Hopefully I don't miss any questions or anything like that that get asked in there. Just to quickly go over our safer spaces policy for everybody. I use these same policies or variation on these when I'm teaching online, and I find that it really helps us to create a positive learning environment. And so my hope is that these guidelines help us to curate a positive community environment today. So when we meet online, there is never a guarantee of confidentiality. Let's be real. So my ask is that you please exercise personal boundaries and discretion with what you share. And I really want to emphasize that, because I find that in spaces like this, where we maybe start to hear things talked about that we've never heard talked about in the open before, they've just been in an online conversation, there's an excitement to that. And sometimes it gets us feeling more safe to be more vulnerable. And in that space, sometimes we over disclose, and we never know what's going to happen when we over disclose. So please do exercise your personal boundaries and discretion with what you share. As the Zoom admin, I'm going to maintain control over video and audio for everybody. And that's really just to ensure smooth flow and avoid interruptions. So we don't hear you in the background yelling at your dog, or we don't hear the phone ring or anything like that. But when we get to sections where we might be asking for questions from the audience, you can use the raise hand features. And if you're not familiar with those, ask in the chat. I'm sure somebody will be able to guide you to them. But there are these lovely little reactions in Zoom. You can show a heart if you really love what someone is saying. But there are also these little raise hand features. And if you use the raise hand feature on Zoom, what that does for me as an admin is it pops you up to the top of the participant list. And that makes it possible for me as the host to see, oh, that person wants to speak. Otherwise, with so many people joining on Zoom, I might miss you if you're just waving your hand around. These sessions are going to be recorded, and I will edit them for later viewing. And there are going to be sections during today that we will stop the live stream, and we'll have an opportunity for interaction here on Zoom, depending on how many people are here at that time. That might look like us going into breakout rooms based on, I have some little surveys prepared for that to help us filter into different breakout rooms, or we might just stay in the same room. Racism, misogyny, ableism, ageism, transphobia, and other forms of discrimination are not conducive to a positive community environment. And so they're not going to be tolerated in this space. I don't foresee any of that coming up, but if it does, I will remove that person from the Zoom room. And that's just because that's how we keep our community we keep a good experience for the majority of our community during this event today. And finally, anti-science rhetoric, conspiracy theories, COVID-19 denialism, anti-masking, QAnon, and related alt-right and fascist ideologies are harmful, and the support or perpetuation of them will result in being removed from the event. So, if you've got a beef around masking, this is not the space to talk about it. I am someone who lives with long COVID as a disability. I am very passionate about making sure that we cultivate spaces of awareness and compassion and support for the immunocompromised and disabled people in our community. And so that is why that policy is there. And if anybody has any questions about any of those, you can message me on the group chat on Zoom, or you can email me, Melina at radicalrelationshipcoaching.ca. All right. Oh my gosh, it is a quarter past the hour, and I need to bring on my special guest here. Let me find where he has gone to in the thing. There we go. There you are. Hi, Miss Love. I'm asking you to unmute. Yeah, it worked.
Hello, everyone. Am I on?
You are. So,
All right.
everybody, this is Miss Love. And Miss Love was there at the beginning. Miss Love was one of the first people to join the original solo polyamory group and became one of the original Mod Squad members. So, I invited him to join me this morning to kind of reminisce over the early days. And I know for you, Miss Love, your relationship landscape doesn't look so much like solo polyamory anymore. But solo polyamory was definitely part of your journey. And I'm wondering if you could like just share with folks like what was it like for you discovering the group and the community and how you connected with everybody?
Yeah, of course. At the time, my life was nomadic, so I roamed around the world aimlessly and basically um, set a vague goal of myself for just exploring different experiences. One of the things I really wanted to find out is whether I would ever find intimacy or love in a way that's compatible with what I needed at the moment. And from the country where I was coming from, where there's not much relationship diversity, I never found like minded people. So when I discovered the solo poly community, I actually quite can't tell you how that came to be, but I think it might have been through blogs and writing because I remember just having huge capacity for reading, especially people's personal blogs. So your writing, Aggie's, and maybe some others. And I think perhaps through that I discovered this community. But to me, uh, the most cherished memories were also traveling and meeting a lot of these people in person. For instance, being on a poly float uh, in Vancouver on a Pride parade. So in a very short time, going from a place in life where I've never met like-minded people to actually being in that spheres where it feels like there is so much. It really filled my heart with a lot of joy, and I enjoyed being a part of the moderator community, especially because I learned so much from it, and it gave me so much language. I noticed my primary language is not English, and I noticed how I'm so much better about talking about my feelings in English than I was in my um, language that I grew up with. Mostly because I got so much language um, from friends like you, from strangers on the group, and I'm really thankful for that. So even though you're right, my relationship landscape doesn't exactly look like it was when I was really strongly identifying with solo poly, I feel I'm not myself. I'm not so much of a different person. I have still the same values, the same needs, and the same ideals. Maybe some circumstances have changed since that, and I've adjusted to them. But I think that it was really an essential part of my growth,
Mm-hmm.
and that without it, I wouldn't have been able to navigate right now the things. I'm a very language oriented person, so the fact that we had so many discussions about this and I saw so many people's other perspectives, it really also put my own experiences into perspective. So it was an amazing journey, and I'm glad to have been there.
Would you say that solo polyamory was like the gateway drug into a whole lot of transformation for you?
Yeah, I don't know if it would be a gateway drug, but it was definitely a revelation that you don't have to compromise on your values,
Hmm.
right? I was at first told that I will never be happy in love unless I'm able to commit to just one person. So I almost succumbed to that in a sense of, well, years are passing, nothing's changing for the better, and everybody's telling me the same thing. So I almost believed them, but then instead, in the big defiant step, I was like, no, I'm going away from all of you. And I went on a train and I never returned to my country. I know that it's not something that everybody can do and has access to do, but I was lucky enough to be able to work remotely. So I spent the next 10 or more years living that life in a really unbounded way, and maybe loving in a same kind of way as well. So um, I guess it was liberating, definitely, or maybe a gateway drug.
I mean, I remember when you came to Vancouver, and that was in 2014. So that was before that we had to like remake the group.
Mm-hmm.
But you were already part of the mod squad at that point. And I remember meeting you in person. I think you would come for like a work conference that just happened to be happening in Vancouver. Um, and oh, someone's asking me where they can see the stream. I'm going to pop that link in there. The link is also posted to the Solo Polyamory Facebook group in case you can't copy paste from there, folks. Um, yeah, I remember in Vancouver, and I remember how you dressed was very like programmer dude, like how I expect a programmer who lives nomadically to dress, like, and seeing that transformation just in how you express yourself, and like starting to see your clothing change, and starting to see the way you held yourself, and how you engaged with people. And I think what I got to see was that confidence really blossom in you through your practice of solo polyamory. And like you said, like the conversations that we would have as the mod squad, I think very much in the early days as well, as we were trying to flesh out like, well, what is okay in our space? Like we want this to be a learning space. So is it okay for people to say things that are dumb, or that we think are dumb? Like, is it okay for people to have arguments? um
And
and
sometimes moderators don't agree, right, on specific guidelines as well. That's I haven't experienced it just in our community, but also in different online communities as well.
I think, yeah, there were a lot of disagreements between us as moderators early on, but I think overall we had an ability to navigate those disagreements and find the compromises and find the middle place, and I think even appreciate like where the other people were coming from. Yeah. Do you remember when we used to have to go and like manually screen each person's profile and message them individually as we welcomed them into the group?
Yeah, I remember still doing that. Was there another way later on?
Yes, we don't have to do that anymore.
What?
Yeah, I think that happened once we hit about 8,000 people. Facebook group features changed, so now it gives us like a little summary of the person, and we can ask the join questions, which basically is now our screening, and we don't have to private message them a welcome because people would like find that message in their other inbox in Facebook like maybe 3 years later.
I was mind blown when you told in the introduction that the group is now 13,000. Did you say that?
13,000.
Wow,
Yeah,
that's
13K.
more than double that I remember it being. So, for context for others, I've been away from also Facebook for a really long time. So, even if I wanted to keep up with the group there, if it's still on Facebook, I wouldn't have been able to. But I'm really glad to see that, to hear that.
Yeah, Adji used to do the pictures of the stadium as we would hit those milestones. Like she would find stock footage of a stadium that held like X number of people. So I think when we hit like 5,000, she found like a football field or something like that and be like, this is what 5,000 people looks like together. And I haven't looked for one of 13,000 people. I think I did one when we hit 10,000. Yeah. Mislav, what do you think have been a couple of highlights for you of being part of the solo poly community, and like meeting people? I mean, you've met solo poly people around the world through your travels. Do you find that there have been differences between the different countries and how people practice, or are we more similar globally than we are different?
So, were you asking about across different continents, across different parts of
Yeah,
the world, how it
yeah.
is? I definitely found differences. For instance, when I would travel to different places, I will notice that people are using similar language. Then I would latch onto that, thinking, "Oh, that's a concept I'm familiar with," and then discover that that they're using it in a very different way. So, for instance, when I arrived in the Netherlands, where I'm currently residing, so I'm calling from the wider area of Amsterdam, I would say, I quit trying to join groups that label themselves as polyamorous because I was shocked about the kind of moderation approaches and the language that they use that very much went against my principles, and how the community is very different here. I'm also very integrated with the burner community, and that one is also very different. You might think that burners are burners, right? But burners around the world, especially North American burners versus European ones, quite a lot of differences. But back to the concept of solo poly, I haven't, especially locally here, I haven't met so many people who identify with the practice. But what I found is a very important thing, such as the fact that not everybody uses those terms to as an identity, but are living the lifestyle. So I know by now very closely some people that would not identify with the terms of solely polyamory, but live the lifestyle as well. And when I ask them, do you think you might belong to this group? They don't. It's not like a calling they feel. It's not any kind of identity. So maybe maybe me and many of us are finding some belonging in certain groups, but I found that some other people are not even either not versed or not introduced to a lot of this vocabulary, but it still doesn't change the fact that they are very much aligned on the value spectrum. So when I then started less being invoking certain phrases that I noticed that people are not familiar with, and when I just started asking them about, like, well, what's your what are your habits like, what's your love like, or what is your ideal lifestyle like, where would you imagine yourself to be, then I would notice that sometimes we're not as different. And through that experience, I think I found that I can't just kind of travel around expecting that everybody thinks the same way that I do, especially because I think I was heavily biased after being a moderator of a very specific group for, I don't know how long I was there, 4 or 5 years.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I maybe became entrenched in the exact like language and purpose that we had. So much that I forgot that people don't speak the same language. And also the fact that when I travel to different countries, I now talk to people in Dutch, I can talk to people in Croatian, in Slovenian, in Serbian, and English. And through all of that, I'm sometimes even get confused what terms are we using and what language are we using. So I try to break it down to just concepts that are much simpler than any kind of group think. But I did felt that I find the most like-minded people along the Pacific Northwest, and that hasn't changed even after living here for a while. So I still have to admit I would feel a longing to be there, but I also feel that it's that the rest of me kind of feels like I want to stay in the continent of my origin, which was also a great decision. So I'm happy here now, but I am sometimes feeling that it was in my past that I found the most like-minded people when it comes to discussions about relationships, for sure.
Thanks for sharing that, Miss Love. I think it's interesting that you're talking about like the way we use the labels, because we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in a little bit when I bring Jai on. Um, but I something that I've noticed, and I don't know if this is true, this is just my anecdotal observation, is that mainland Europe, I think because that's more the heart of relationship anarchy as we know it today, there's less adhesion to labels, whereas there's something in North American colonial culture where we find a lot of meaning and belonging through these identity labels. And I don't know if that is true, if that's my own bias projecting anything there. Maybe I've got it, maybe I don't have the full picture, but yeah, it's interesting how we relate to those labels differently. And I really appreciate hearing you talk about what it's like to talk about these ideas in all the different languages and like code switching between them of like, okay, this is the words that people use about this here. Yeah, and I've always found that it's interesting for me when I meet people in my dating life to not even use the label solo polyamory at first, to just describe how I date and then add the label on. Because I find that people kind of everybody has their own idea about what it is. So I'd rather give them the description and then tell them what I call it. Um, so that they don't have any preconceived notions when they hear that label. Yeah.
I think same for me when I stopped telling people that I'm polyamorous in the first place. Not even solo polyamorous, it's even double the confusion. But I felt a lot of the times that people were harmed by somebody who said those same words about them and mistreated um, in their past. So when another person like me who looks similar and uses similar language comes across, they're already bracing for like, oh no, how is this person now gonna not treat me with care or with attention, and then they would be surprised how I'm very different. And over the time I stopped using specific labels in the groups of people where those labels were not meaning as much.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that was beneficial in the sense that then people could skip a certain abstract concept and just go straight to like, well, they're just meeting me directly, so without the context of some wider paradigm. And that was pretty useful. But it was also very useful for me to approach a new situation with confidence. And I really think that being a solo poly person for most of my adult life actually built up that confidence and made me into a person who approaches other people with a lot of courage instead of using intimacy as like a means of escape. I think the author Bell Hooks once written that learning how to be alone is central to the act of loving, and I've really still identify with that. And I think that in the strip everything else around my life that is circumstantial, at the center of it is like one loving person who's trying to like figure out how he relates to the world. And without it I don't think I would be as much fulfilled as I am today in this moment in life.
Thank you so much. I love that. It's a beautiful note to wrap up on as we hit the half hour. I hope you stay on and are able to tune into some of the rest of the sessions today. Thank you, Miss Love, so much for joining us all the way from the Netherlands. So I'm going to mute you and I will unpin you. And Jai, are you ready? I'm going to add your pin in here and invite you to unmute.
Hello, hello,
Hi.
hello.
Welcome.
Thank you. This is awesome. I'm so glad you're doing this event. It feels very timely in lots of different ways.
Oh, I'm so glad. Thank you for joining me here today. I'm like the tables are flipped all of a sudden.
Right.
So I met Jai through their work with a fantastic organization called Conscious Life. Am I remembering that right? Who put on a bunch of amazing super conferences that are like free to sign up for, the kind of things where they have lots of different speakers, and there's so many speakers in one day you can't possibly see all the talks, so you can go buy the recordings later. But Jai reached out to interview me for one a few years ago, and the trauma super conference, and then there was the relationship super conference, and then there's more coming up. But then you also have your own podcast, Beyond Boxes, and I feel like you've done such an incredible a piece of community service and bringing and amplifying the voices of a lot of people in the alternative relationship community. not just with people who are solo polyamorous, but also relationship anarchists, people who are, queering relationship theory in a really big way. And I think you also bring a lot to that conversation from your own experience. And just from the brief conversation catch up that we had last time we did an interview, when you were interviewing me, I was like, I think I want Jai to come and like chat about this, because I think you've got some really, just from all the people you've interviewed, I think you've got so much perspective on how all the different people see these things, but you've also got your own fantastic set of insights. So I would love you to just introduce yourself however you want to the folks here on Zoom and those on the live stream.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. So my name is Jai Bristow. I am what I call gender free. So my pronouns are they, them. I'm multi-ethnic, multicultural, queer, inherently non-monogamous, but not practicing polyamory. And we'll talk about that in a bit. And what else can I say about me? I'm someone who falls a lot into in-between categories, right? So often not belonging to the dominant culture, but not actually belonging to the oppressed categories either. And so that in-betweenness has led me to be curious and led me to want to know more and discover and be interested in meeting other people who fall outside and go beyond boxes, which is where the name of my podcast and YouTube channel came from, which was very much an exploration of labels and identity and the pros and cons of using labels and identity, which has already come up a little bit in your conversation earlier. And then I also freelance for Conscious Life, where I host these online summits that you were talking about. And I think that's me.
I really relate to what you said about like being between these spaces. And I think that like that intersectionality, I come from a background that has, I am the first in 6 generations from my matrilineal side who hasn't been a refugee, who hasn't faced genocide or eugenics, who, has been able to have a more or less stable life. And yet, despite all that ancestral trauma, I have all the privilege of someone who presents as white in the world. And I've had the privilege of a lot of private education. And I'm also someone who lives with disability. And I live in a country that I wasn't born in, and so on and so forth. And I think that I think when you live a life like that, it does give you a perspective of questioning the status quo more, because you know that there's a difference for this one thing. So why isn't there a different way for other things? And I think we inherently, like when you grow up between cultures, right, you are trying to find your own way through things.
100%. And I think you and I have a lot in common in that regard. And we've connected. I've got to interview you a whole bunch of times now for the different events on my podcast and other things. And we've definitely connected on those points before. And, every time I have a conversation with someone who similarly goes beyond boxes in some way, shape or form, and falls between categories, whether it's to do with their identity in terms of, country, nationality, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, all these things where there's not really an existing community with set history, which is why you created your own community for this, for example, which is fantastic, right? But you needed to create your own because even though other people have been practicing this form of relationship since probably much longer than we can imagine, it's not recognized in the mainstream in the same way. And so finding community can be much more tricky. And I think when you're beyond categories, when you go beyond boxes in some ways, it can be, harder to feel that sense of belonging. Mm-hmm. And so you end up creating your own spaces and connecting with people where what you most have in common is that you don't really fit into any of the other boxes, right?
You just described my social group in high school. We were the misfits. We were the social outcasts, and there was this one corner of the playground where we would all hang out together during break time. And then somehow through the years we became the cool kids. I still don't know how that happened. So I yeah, we have a lot in common on that. And I'm curious to know for you, like, what was your journey into non-monogamy? Because I know a little bit from what you've shared with me, but I think it would be really fun to just dive into that, because I think you've had a very dynamic journey.
That's one way of putting it. All right, I'll try to make this not too long, but basically similar to what you shared about yourself earlier, for me, it started in childhood, right? Like from the very early ages, I grew up in a sort of hippie community vibe, and my two best friends, I don't know if it's okay to use real names. We'll call them E and B. And E was a girl and B was a boy. And we grew up, they were a bit older than me, both of them. And we grew up, the three of us together, and, you know, grew and learned from each other, and me, especially from them because they were older. And we played, you know, all the typical games of like doctors, mum and dad, family stuff together. But we always mixed up all the different ways of doing that, right? There wasn't a gendered way of doing that. It wasn't based on age, on gender, on anything like that. It was, or even on numbers. It was just, we'd all kind of mix and match. So from a very, very early age, there was already that kind of queer, unusual style. And then again, because I grew up in a sort of like with hippies and with alternative parenting style and in community, you know, I was raised by a village, and I very much knew a lot of people who had alternative ways of living, and then I traveled a lot and all that kind of thing. So yeah, that was one big thing. And then at what point did I really, at uni, I had my first quote unquote serious relationship, which was what I'm going to call a monogamish relationship, because not only did me and my partner have an agreement that I could sleep with a certain gender, but also I did end up sleeping with a different gender, and then, which was cheating, like that was what it was. But then we talked it through, and I remember feeling really bad about hurting my partner. But I didn't feel like I'd actually, like, I felt bad about hurting them, so I knew I'd done something wrong because I'd hurt them. But the actual act of sleeping with someone that I had a connection with didn't feel guilty about that. I felt guilty that had hurt my partner, if that makes sense.
It makes perfect sense.
So there was already a big like opening around that. And then me and my partner had a big chat about like what that meant for our relationship, and whether my partner was about to go on holiday just after I got back, because it happened whilst I was away for about 6 weeks. And we were very new to each other as well. It was a new relationship. And then when I got back, my partner was going away, and we talked about whether my partner was going to sleep with other people and that kind of thing. And then in the end decided not, that didn't make sense, because it would have been out of revenge rather than out of desire. But, you know, so those conversations were already there in my very early long-term relationships, right? And also I can resonate to what I think Ms. Lav was saying earlier about, you know, I traveled a lot from a very early age. I was traveling and I had a very nomadic lifestyle. So I'd meet people and I'd have very intense but short-term connections with people. And then I'd go off and then sometimes see them again and that kind of thing. And then it wasn't really until 2016, when I moved to London, that I really integrated into the polyamorous community. And I discovered my people, this intersection of like sex positive, kinky, queer, ethically non-monogamous sort of community. And it was great because even before that, I'd been, you know, figuring out stuff around my sexual orientation and being interested in kink and play parties and that kind of thing with some of my cis-het mono friends. And so then to have all of this, and I was dating someone at the time that I met on an online app who identified as polyamorous. And I was very clear that I wasn't polyamorous, but I didn't mind that he was. Just so long as like he was okay with me not being it, and that I wasn't looking for anything serious. I just moved to London, all that kind of thing. But then meanwhile, I integrated this whole community, which he actually wasn't part of. And then thankfully I did, because that relationship was actually a very toxic relationship. And it was so interesting because I thought that like the problem was me and that I didn't understand polyamory, and that's why the relationship wasn't working, was toxic. But because I had this fantastic community around me of people who had been practicing really healthy, ethical non-monogamy, honest non-monogamy, polyamory, whatever we want to call it today, they were able to point out and be like, that's not okay. The problem isn't that you're not polyamorous. The problem is that behavior is toxic behavior. And I think it's really important to recognize that all relationship forms, whether monogamous or non-monogamous, whether polyamorous, relationship anarchy, whether friendship, whether lover, whether partner, they can all have toxicity in them. They can all be manipulative, sometimes abusive, and that it's, I think, harder sometimes to recognize when you're doing alternative relationship styles, because you can feel like, oh, this, especially if the person has been doing that relationship style since longer than you feel like, oh, they probably know better. And especially if, like, I'm non-binary, but I was socialized and conditioned as a woman. So I took on a lot of these ideals. And this is why, I used he, him pronouns for him, because he was a man. And there was that power dynamic there as well of, at the time, I was perceived and presented as a cisgendered woman, and he was a cisgendered man. And even though I was very much queer in my sexual orientation, there was that power dynamic there. And he used to get annoyed with me at the beginning because I wasn't dating other people and he had another girlfriend. And I was like, I respect that you have other partners, but you have to respect that right now I'm focused on work, on building friendships and building community, and I don't want to date anyone else. And then I did start dating someone else, and he got very jealous and possessive because he'd broken up with his other partner. So, like, lots of toxic cycles that I won't get into. But I remember the moment that I was part of this community. I'd gone to a bunch of really cool parties. I just met this woman I had a huge crush on. Actually, I just had this fantastic threesome with 2 women who I ended up dating both of afterwards, but separately. And I was still dating this guy. And I remember the moment that I was at this queer party the night before we'd gone to another party, and I'd met my partner's girlfriend for the first time. I'd met, like, all these people, and it had just felt so natural to me. Like, everyone was just there. I mean, we'd taken a bunch of drugs, which probably also helped the natural feeling. But it was just, and I remember feeling that moment of, oh, this works. I want to do this regardless of my relationship with this guy. This is no longer about him. This works for me. This sense of, like, community and belonging and, like, ethical non-monogamy, and just being able to connect with people in whichever way felt natural with no pressure or expectation, being able to experiment with my sexuality. And by that, I mean not just my sexual orientation and the genders of people I sleep with, but also what I liked, what I didn't, being able to begin to, like, uncondition and unprogram all the, like, very harmful stereotypes I had around sex and pleasure and penises and vaginas and all that kind of stuff. And so that was a real big switch for me. And for quite a few years, I was actively polyamorous, and I had all my relationships were polyamorous. And I tell people on date number 1, I am polyamorous. You have to be on board, because I'm not doing it any other way. And this is the way I am. But I got so identified with it that it actually became a bit like, the crab bucket theory, the idea that, like, we were talking about beyond boxes. It became like I went from one set of rules of monogamy that didn't quite work for me into a very rigid other set of rules.
Yeah.
And then I got chronically ill and was bedbound for 15 months and had to take a big hiatus from dating and was in a wheelchair and that kind of thing. And then when I came back onto the scene, I met this couple, and it was a week after their wedding, and we ended up in a throuple, which was also completely unplanned. None of us were looking to be in a throuple.
Wow.
And that was a really beautiful, healing relationship in a lot of ways. And then I went off traveling, and I met someone, and I fell in love with a small town white boy who said things like, "That's so gay," and "I'm not racist, but," and was very much not, like, compatible with me on paper, but was also a total sweetheart, right? And he was, like, ready to get married and have kids. And I questioned, like, is this what I want? Am I, like, fooling myself with all this polyamory stuff? And I realized that wasn't what I wanted, but that actually the ways I'd been doing non-monogamy, that I'd been doing polyamory, were no longer serving me. That I'd learned a lot, that I was grateful for the relationships I had, but that I realized I was ending up often in this pattern where I'd either end up dating people who already had primary partners and didn't really have time and space for me, or I date people who were single but were so identified with being polyamorous that they were, like, constantly actively looking to date other people and were scared to build a relationship with me because it might undermine how polyamorous they are if they weren't actively dating 15 people at once. And I realized how, like, there is toxic culture in the non-monogamous polyamorous scene as well as in the monogamous scene. And, and that's the point where I started moving away from identifying as polyamorous and recognizing that I think non-monogamy will always be an inherent part of my identity, the same way queer is an inherent part of my identity, but that I didn't want to be part of that scene anymore. And that, you know, you and I in the podcast episode we recorded together talked about the descriptive labels versus prescriptive. And I noticed how so many people would take polyamory and have this very rigid definition of what it meant, right? Which can be said of so many other identities as well. And so since then, you know, I have this idea of my ideal relationship, but I'm much more attuned to just questioning what works for me and what doesn't. And actually, for the last 6 months or so, I've been in what I call a monogamous relationship with myself. And it's been incredible because I feel like I finally get what solo polyamory is all about. Like before that, I was actually, what I was practicing wasn't solo polyamory. I realized that my whole life I was practicing some form of relationship anarchy and identifying as solo polyamory, but that my primary relationship wasn't with myself. I was constantly putting other people's first. I always had a best friend who, you know, I didn't have romantic partners weren't my priority, but I always had a best friend who was the main person in my life who I'd give my everything to. I had like codependent relationships. And so by being in a monogamous relationship with myself and allowing myself to explore connections, to feel that kind of chemistry with people, but be like, no, like acting like the way I would if I was in a monogamous relationship with someone else, right? It's like, oh, I can feel, I can flirt, but I'm not going to act upon this. And again, like I broke up with my best friend quite recently. And so all of that culminated to me having a very different view on relationships. I'm also hosting this next super conference, which is called Heal Toxic Relationships. And so I've learned a lot about that. And as of last week, I officially said, okay, me, myself, and I, we've had a chat. We're ready to open up our relationship and allow some other people in, so long as we don't lose touch with ourselves. Yeah. Like, so long as I'm not falling into old habits of, you know, pursuing and giving up my relationship with myself in order to become or be what I think someone else wants of me. And I just had my very first date since then today, which I suddenly realized the time was like, oh my God. So we had to cut the date slightly short so that I could rush back. And I think that the person might even be watching us right now.
I see lots of little heart reacts coming up on the screen at that news.
No.
That's wonderful. And thank you for sharing so much about that journey, Jai. Like there's so many pieces that you touched on that I feel are a piece of the universal experiences that we often have. I mean, that piece around self-partnering, you know, what you are discovering through that, I think it's at the core of what a lot of people find through solo polyamory. I mean, solo polyamory, I see it as a description of how I do relationships, because I don't know, it's how I'm always going to do things. I had a year where I was like, maybe I'm leaving it behind. But that idea of coming out of the patterns of enmeshment and codependency and surrendering our agency to partners, you know, the practice of self-partnering is so powerful for helping us to shake out of that habit when it is so deeply ingrained. I mean, that's what I go into when I talk about the monogamy hangover. Like, I think that's one of the biggest pieces, the idea that we have to be self-sacrificing to demonstrate our love for somebody. And how radical it is to actually prioritize ourselves. And, you know, I think there's a lot of stigma that says, oh, you're being selfish and that's a bad thing. And it is actually so empowering because it allows us to really know ourselves for who we are. And as you're describing, you know, the way you were navigating the poly community early on, that lovely intersection of queer and non-monogamous and kinky and everything, like, yeah, that there is that, it's almost like we have two very different polyamorous communities in the world. There are people practicing polyamory who are doing it from what I would describe as a very cis, hetero, mononormative perspective, where they tend to be more hetero couples. Maybe they're open to a little bit of homosexuality, like a little heteroflexible, should we say. But they're still very much primary. They're still very much entrenched in that couple's privilege. And there's not a lot of queering of relating going on. And when we look at that, the word queer as a verb, as something we can do, how do we queer relationships? How do we challenge the status quo? I feel like that's what the other arm of polyamory has been doing, is exploring, well, how do we queer the thing that we're already doing that is going against the norm? How do we even unpack all the other pieces around it? And depending on what we're going through in our life, what our resources are, what conversations we come across, who we come across, we may explore really deep down that rabbit hole, or we may just kind of dance around it a little bit. But I love that you found that queer space to explore in. But I also really honor that so much of this has been your journey. Like, it is very personal to you, and that you have, through all of it, had that introspection. It sounds like that self-relationship was there. It just
definitely,
there wasn't that sense of like, how do I turn towards that as the thing I navigate by?
it's interesting because Ali Hendry, who I think is also one of the speakers today, was interviewing me for the relationship room once, and we were talking about solo poly, and she said something about how it what's great about it is that you're always in a relationship, right? Because your primary relationship with yourself. And I said, oh, I see it as always being single. And I think that's two really interesting ways to look at solo poly and question like your own way of doing it, but and someone else's. And I think for me, I was coming from it as always single, whereas I think for now I'd come at it from always being in a relationship. And I'm not saying that one's better than the other. I'm just saying it's super interesting to think about that way, because just like with all these other alternative identities, just because there's a word doesn't mean everyone has the same definition of that word, right? And so these days I'll meet someone and they'll tell me that they're polyamorous, and I won't just go, oh, no, run the hell away. But I won't be like, oh, cool, me too. I'll be like, okay, what does that mean for you? And same with anything else. If someone tells me they're non-binary, okay, what does that mean for you? If someone tells me they're bisexual, okay, what does that mean for you? Because these are all basically umbrella terms that mean I'm not part of the dominant category and I'm not part of the obvious alternative. And it's like, okay, so let's figure out, what do these words mean when they're umbrella terms? And I think that's what's interesting. That's what it's interesting, is to have those conversations. And like you said, you don't tell people in advance, hi, I'm solo poly, let's go on a date, because people are going to have a whole bunch of ideas of what that means. You describe your relationship style, you describe what you're looking for, the way you are operating, and then you say, and I call that solo poly, right? And so for me, I think it's similar. If I'm going to meet new people, I describe who I am, what I'm looking for, what my priorities are, and then I can attribute a name to it or not. And right now, I don't have a clear label, or I did monogamous relationship with myself, and then now I'm just opening that up, right? So right this minute, I don't have a clear label for my relationship style, and that's okay, because I have more clarity than I've ever had on exactly who I am and what I want and what I'm looking for.
I love that. And that the whole like being in a primary relationship with yourself, like I remember I started saying that to people because I was sick and tired of the questions that I would get every time I'd go on a date with someone polyamorous was, do you have a primary partner? Do you have a primary partner? That even when I wasn't on a date, that was one of the questions people would ask me at like meetups, do you have a primary? And I was so fed up with that question. I'm like, fuck it, I'm my own primary. Okay, let's get that clear. The person you are negotiating with to have a relationship with me is me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I see Nancy popped in the chat here. We're always in a relationship with ourselves. Yeah. And we're always single. How do these two perspectives shift the way we think about ourselves and our relationships? And I think, yeah, it's such an interesting mindset to explore of, I'm always in a relationship with myself. And sometimes that relationship is one I neglect or I forget about or I get complacent around. And sometimes it's one that I'm really celebrating and feel invigorated by and get waves of like fresh NRE around. And I can still have relationships with other people even from that primary space. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think for me, when I was operating from the perspective of always being single, for example, then I would, even though I didn't really prioritize that primary relationship with myself, right? So I was single, but with the idea of SOPO or solo polyamory. And so when people had other primary partners, I was like, that's fine because I'm my own primary partner. But I wasn't actually actively, I actually felt single all the time. And then I felt disappointed that I wasn't getting my needs met by my other partners. Whereas now there's that shift to, oh, actually, yeah, I am my primary partner. And that's super important for me to maintain and work on that relationship, to find time for date nights on my own, to find time for sex on my own with myself, to find time to just, curl up and be and check in with myself and check in with how I feel, and to sense into like, yeah, is this serving me? Is this bringing like additional joy into my life rather than coming from a need or a lack perspective?
I think one of the most delightful pieces of that is, and I don't know if this has been your experience, but it certainly has been mine, is that cultivating that self relationship, having that, I can have a really great date by myself. I know how to show myself a real good time. It has changed, it's raised the bar. So when someone wants to engage with me in a date sense, they really have to be bringing something extraordinary.
Yeah, it's like, is this
to the mix.
more? Exactly. It's like, is this better than spending time on my own, right? And I remember when a friend of mine texted me, I was like, I went on a date, and honestly, I would have had a better time if I was curled up on the couch by myself. And I think also when you have chronic health conditions, when you have disability, you're much more aware of like prioritizing where your energy goes, because you have much more limited energy and spoons than like the average person. And so you don't have time to quote unquote waste on people who are going to like drain you or who are going to use up spoons, when actually spending a night curled up on the sofa would have been a better option. So
oh, Jai, we are at the top of the hour, and I am so grateful for you joining us today and sharing about your experience and your wisdom. If folks want to find your content online, how do they find you?
Thank you. My website, Jai Bristow, or Jai A Bristow, and my Instagram, beyond_boxes, are probably the best places.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And
Thank you,
I'm going to see you again in a few weeks when we record another interview for
looking forward to it.
Trauma Super Conference coming up.
The fourth edition of the Trauma Super Conference, which will air in February. And meanwhile, we've already recorded our interview for the Heal Toxic Relationship Super Conference, which was not the best name, really good content. And that will be available in November. And again, if people follow me on Instagram and sign up to my mailing list, I don't spam people at all. In fact, I underpost and under email, but I let people know when there's a big event coming up.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jai.
Thank you.
I will unpin you, and I just see a few comments coming in here in Zoom. Some gratitude for all those insights. Eunice shares, potential partners don't have to be a better option than other people. They have to be better than the time with myself alone, which is a much higher standard. Yeah, I think that's one of the like magic insights that so many of us do encounter in the practice of solo polyamory when we get started, is like, wow, like I this is a whole different standard. And I think that in non-monogamy at large, when people are, certainly when we're just starting, there's that feeling of like, you get to be a kid in the candy store of like, oh my gosh, I can date all the people, oh my gosh, this is so exciting. And sometimes we do get into that space of like, oh, but like, is it worth it? Like, I'm dating all the people, but am I actually feeling nourished from all this lovely candy? So I'm going to invite our next guest on. Michelle, I see you just joined us. I'm going to add your pin, and I'm going to invite you to unmute. So you probably, if you go on the internet, you have come across Michelle's work. Michelle posts as Polyamorous While Asian on Instagram, and I'm thrilled. This is the first time we've actually like had a face-to-face conversation. We've messaged each other on Instagram and shared each other's stuff a whole bunch. And when I was putting together my like dream team list of guests who I wanted to have on this, Michelle, your name was like right at the top. So welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself to the folks here on Zoom and those watching on the live stream?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's really great to be here, and thank you very much for thinking about me for your the solo polyamory day. Yeah, as Mel said, my name's Michelle, pronounced she her. I'm in Portland, Oregon, lovely gray Portland, Oregon. And I'm sorry if there's a bit of a commotion in the background. One of my cats has the zoomies right now. Um yeah, so I mostly live on Instagram as polyamorous while Asian. I've been actively doing the non-monogamy thing since about 2012 when I was about 18. And I've like transitioned or more identified with solo polyamory for the past about 6 years. And yeah, so I started the page in 2020 when for some reason we were all stuck inside. And instead of creating sourdough starters, I started that page because I didn't see as many openly polyamorous Asian people. And where I'm at in life, I feel more safe and able to be publicly out and to talk about my experiences. So yeah, I focus talking about polyamory from my own lived experience. And I also like to try to amplify other people who practice polyamory and are also in more like marginalized communities, just to, diversify the space just a little bit. And yeah, that's basically me in a nutshell.
Awesome. Yeah, I remember when I started my Instagram at the beginning of 2020, and then suddenly there was that explosion during lockdown of all sorts of amazing, wonderful people jumping on Instagram to talk about polyamory. And your work immediately stood out to me as having such a deep understanding of nuance, which I think is rare in the online sort of like Instagram influencer world. A lot of people get the shares because they oversimplify the message, but what you offer and how you articulate it, I've always felt like it taps into the things aren't always black and white. There are nuances to the experience. And there's a lot of compassion in the way that you write about things, which I think creates more accessibility for people to learn from. I'm wondering if you would share with us a little bit, because you said that you've been practicing non-monogamy since 2012, but it's only for the last 6 years that you've really been drawn to solo polyamory. So I'm curious to know more about like what that journey has been for you, and are there shadow sides to either sides of those experiences?
Yeah, like most of us, my first polyamorous experience was not great. So yeah, I was about 18, and the reason why like I was introduced to just the concept, the word polyamory or non-monogamy, was because my first partner at the time, 14 years my senior, had never done non-monogamy himself necessarily. He had read Sex at Dawn maybe a few months before. He had recommended it to me. And also at the time when he met me, he had also had another girlfriend, but he didn't explicitly tell me that. Um, anyway, that seems like from the sounds of it, it would be the foundation for like a wonderful, trusting, beautiful relationship. Yeah. So I was in that relationship for about 5 years. And in that, figuring out the non-monogamy thing, also figuring out life as like, late teens, early 20s person, college and all
As
that
you
stuff.
do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that started off more as like having having more of an anchor partner, and eventually we moved in together. So then having like a main nesting partner, and then having, partners kind of revolving around that. However, like a few years in, I did start connecting with a few other partners. And it's no surprise that connecting with those partners, which, much healthier, much more open communication, there's much more compassion, honesty in those relationships. I finally finished college. I've got my first like full-time job and all that. So then I had the comfort to like separate myself from that first relationship. And so with that, like a lot of lessons learned, a lot of trial by fire, a lot of lessons learned, very valuable, but that also require therapy to to unravel. But yeah, after that, after living with a person that ultimately was, it just was not a good relationship. I moved out, lived with roommates and things like that. But I realized I enjoyed not living with a partner.
Mm.
And to this day, I'm not like 100% opposed to living with partners. I just know the circumstances would have to be there would have to be certain criteria that would have to be met. I would have to have my own room, there would have to be enough space in the home, for my own like permitting and whatnot. Or like I often joke, semi joke that, my ideal would be like all of us living in the same neighborhood, within, a 10-15 minute walk from each other, or something like that would be wonderful. But yeah, so that started. I don't think I was aware of the term solo polyamory at the time when I like split from that first relationship. But eventually I found that term and I'm like, oh, I think that's just what I'm doing.
Mm.
And since then, solo polyamory isn't necessarily a label that I've been like pursuing as a sort of goal. I use it descriptively just as someone who doesn't live with partners, who doesn't necessarily share like joint finances, pay bills with partners. Um, but also still have very meaningful connected relationships, and often I touch on like the financial aspect. I think sometimes people think that like, oh, everyone, you go Dutch, everyone pays for their own thing, and there's never any sort of like crossing of the streams with regard to money. But um but no, it's just that we don't, pay our like day-to-day, month-to-month bills together.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's basically, the general arc of my journey. And being solo polyamorous now, I'm loving non-monogamy even more than ever. Who
Oh,
knows what, future Michelle is going to want or need, but that's a future Michelle thing. And for now, like it gets better.
it does. And I think many of us have had those early experiences of what I would call messy non-monogamy.
Mhm.
Those of you here on Zoom, you can just do a little react maybe if you've ever had that early experience of messy non-monogamy. Because I think I feel like that is part of like the rite of passage we go through in non-monogamy. And I sometimes wonder if there's like a non-monogamous pipeline of some kind. It's like, okay, you read Sex at Dawn or Ethical Slut, and then you're like, this sounds like a great idea. And then you have the messy non-monogamy experience, and then slowly you gravitate towards like, oh, what does this actually mean for me? And what are the values I actually want to explore and practice? Um, and I love what you said about how for you solo polyamory is a descriptive thing, that you were doing it this way and then you discovered that there was a term that people were using to articulate that. um, and I know when I asked like, what is it you want to talk about here today, you did mention, that solo polyamory, is a way to affirm independence and community. So I'm curious, like, what has that been for you? Like, how do you find your space and community through the practice of solo polyamory?
Yeah, and up front, it's a continual work in progress. Like my reaction after my first relationship, like I think a lot of where the solo polyamorous aspects come as a reaction to coming out of a really bad relationship. So like being basically like on top of each other, like arguing, every other day, just having no space to breathe, and then just like breaking out of that to just kind of find out what I actually want, what I actually need, giving myself the elbow room to explore and whatnot. Like it really kind of further deepened, I think, any more avoidantly attached aspects that I already had. Because I already have the tendency to try to run away from certain things, run
Mm.
away from discomfort, run away from drama or any potential, conflict and things like that. And so the decision to live apart from partners was definitely motivated a bit by that, and continues to be slightly motivated by that, though I'm finding a little less and less. And and so I think with a lot of solo polyamory, and one of the reasons why I like to emphasize that I use it more descriptively as opposed to like, oh, this is like a goal, is that I don't really want to focus too much on like the solo aspect of it. The solo aspect of it almost seems kind of incidental. And I think just like a lot of, and I think we've, a lot of us have observed this, where a lot of good non-monogamy practice is just good relationship practice, regardless of your, relationship orientation. And I think a lot of, some good like solo polyamory practice can be applicable to, broader non-monogamy practice or monogamy practice, like certain aspects of, really focusing on yourself. And in that way of like making sure that your cup is filled so that you can fill other people's cups and, vice versa. And that's how I like to focus on my solo polyamory, where I like to focus on like, what do I want and what do I don't want? Like, and just kind of going from there. A lot of my first relationship, a lot of bad boundaries on my part. I didn't even realize that boundaries were like a thing or a good thing.
Yeah.
In my upbringing.
We don't know that they
Right.
exist.
No. In my upbringing, it almost seemed like it would be an affront to authority to have certain boundaries or to have strong boundaries. And so that was something that I had to learn. And I'm still learning, and probably will still keep learning until the day I die. That yeah, like, do I want to actually do this certain thing in relationship or be in this relationship? Or am I serving this like certain idea of what this relationship should be, of what I think a good partner should be? Because there's a certain degree of negotiation and compromise in relationships. But if, one or both parties are finding themselves doing things that they actively don't want to do too much, then resentment builds. Then you have these cascading effects, if they're unchecked, of just kind of crumbling at the foundation of that relationship. So for example, like a partner asked me if I wanted to sleep over more or just do more like sleepovers. For me, most of the time I just sleep in my bed alone. And bad habit, but I like to swipe through TikTok and stuff like that in bed and just have like my little bed routine. So I'm often much more comfortable with just sleeping by myself. However, I also acknowledge that like this is a bid. This is them asking for more quality time in a certain way, and so I found myself in a position of kind of declining, of saying I'm not completely close to that. I will say I'm not as comfortable with sleepovers, but we can, if you're looking for more consistency in our date nights or something like that, we can talk, we can look in our calendars, we can find other ways to, have more of this quality time. And so I think that's what a lot of like the, I don't know, solo polyamory, going back to the question of like, the soloness plus the community part. If the soloness isn't, in service ultimately of creating connection, this isn't to say that, people are doing solo polyamory wrong. But I do think that sometimes with soloness, some people can drift too far into the hyper independence, the self-isolation, and are cutting themselves off from valuable forms of connection, of rejuvenation, recharging. And to be human, even for introverted people, is to be social.
Yeah. I really appreciate that you added that in, because like I'm thinking about I think for many of us, that initial motivation to be solo can come from a space of like avoidance, or having had a really overwhelming experience that we're still recovering from, of being very enmeshed or living with somebody, et cetera, et cetera. And we do need that time alone and that time to ourselves to basically heal, and maybe do some therapy too, and do other practices that work for us. And yet I do see that happen as well, that people can become hyper individualistic, and sometimes that also comes from that trauma response of like, if you had a very enmeshed relationship, if you got burnt out from how much you were caregiving or responding to a partner, there's going to be that like, okay, I'm going to go to the opposite, and I'm going to shut down my empathy for others, and I'm just going to disconnect emotionally from my relationships. And sometimes we need to do that for a while, but ultimately human beings, we didn't evolve in isolation. We evolved in communities. And I think about this when it comes to attachment theory, because I think the Western take on attachment theory is so centered on the nuclear family model. It forgets that we emerged in villages, right? We emerged with community. And I think there's a part of non-monogamy in general that I get curious about, like, is that part of our quest to reclaim community in some sense? And that tension, that dance that we get into in solo polyamory of like, well, okay, I have my independence and I have my autonomy, and I also have community. And how do I engage in community in a way that doesn't exhaust me, but actually nourishes me? And I think that curiosity about that is one of the most beautiful parts of this practice. and and I love that you said like you don't know where it's going to go, because I think it could go in so many different places. Like I see in the chat, a lot of folks, you definitely feel called out by we've all had the messy non-monogamy experiences, but also that a lot of resonance with that idea of like building a community, like being able to live close to your polycule. I think especially on the Pacific Northwest coast, we all have that queer poly utopia fantasy of the tiny home village. Where we're going to give it a piece of land and we're all going to get our tiny homes and the whole polycule will live there and we'll all live happily ever after. And yeah, I think it does offer us a way to counteract that hyper independence draw, to have that community to connect with.
Yeah, because like Eunice says in the chat, like being vulnerable is super scary. I mean, like it's there's some days where it's like, oh God, be vulnerable, like not like stop intellectualizing my feelings and like actually open up to this person and stuff. Like I would rather be thrown into like a Saw movie. It's like it's just like so yeah, it's like you were saying, where it's like it can often be seen as a sort of reaction, as a sort of trauma response and whatnot. And I have definitely resonated with that in my experience. But yeah, in my therapy, a lot of it is like my therapist has affirmed that like, I'm good at doing a lot of stuff on my own. I'm really good at living on my own, doing stuff like independently. But the rest of my healing, like I cannot do the rest of my healing just alone, just sitting in my apartment, just trying to, try to turn over every stone again and again and again. Like part of it has to be about co-regulating with other partners. If I do have strong feelings that come up, there are certain ways that like I can try to re-regulate my nervous system and stuff, but like sometimes just reaching out to a person that I trust, like really deeply trust, like can really calm my nervous system, like bringing it back down to regulation, and not in a like a cure-all instantaneous way. But yeah, healing, I think especially you were talking about earlier, in the social media space and black and white, no nuance and whatnot. And I think healing can be a very like general term. But yeah, personal healing and growth can't just be done on the individual level, especially if we're wanting to or expecting to continue to move through society and be amongst other people. It's that a lot of the healing and growth, like part of it has to be done, with other people, because in my perspective, it's like in my opinion, it's like, well, what else? Yeah, what else is the healing and growth for? To be a more grounded individual, more confident individual, not just for the sake of it, but so that I can be, so that I can bring that energy to the people that I like, and continue that cycle of like feeding each other in that way.
Yeah, I always visualize it like an ecosystem in
Mhm.
relationships. Like we could go function individually and like be away from other people, but then we're going to require a lot of like adding in fertilizers, and like how are we supporting ourselves to find connection when we need that nourishment. So
Mhm.
being part of an ecosystem where there is that reciprocal, we're in this together, we're supporting each other. One person's having a hard time, let's support that person. Somebody else is feeling abundant, they share that abundance out in some way. Maybe they throw a party, or run a fundraiser for somebody. Like there's that community building aspect, that I think is so essential. And I'm wondering, for you, well, I'm thinking about this because I know for some people who feel like it's connecting is too scary, and it is, like you said, vulnerable. How have you been able to discern that you can trust somebody? Like, how have you identified, these are the people that are in my community, these are the people that I can hold in that circle of trust and be more vulnerable with and share my struggles with, outside of my therapy sessions?
Yeah. I mean, this, like, again, I think this falls into the category of continual work in progress. Um, but over the years, I think especially in the past like 6 or 7 years, just kind of like growing into adulthood and all of that sort of thing, general life stuff, just being more certain about what I want or don't want. I think that's
Mhm.
huge. Like it's very it sounds very simple, of course, and again, like most things, it's easier said than done. But it's like, oh, I want, um, like, for example, with regard to say like sex positivity, like I want and need people who are not only tolerant of like my sexual activity and just how open I am with sex, but I need people who are openly enthusiastic about it. Because otherwise, I just know by now through like trial and error and whatnot, like it just won't work. And so things like that, where it's like that you have right. So I have um a certain phrase that I've used called like high standards, low expectations, where it's like you've got to be like this tall a ride, but after that we can like figure out what we want to do together, and whatever that is, whatever is organic with this relationship. But like, yeah, you have to meet certain criteria. Like you have to be like really, really solid with consent. You can't be wishy-washy, like, oh, but must be blah blah blah. Like, like you have to be solid with consent. You have to be also you have to be very um like oh god, the word just slipped away from me, but basically very again, not just tolerant of, but super accepting of, the way that I, move through life, basically, where it's like, the being respectful of the solo polyamory thing, being respectful of my time, being respectful of this and that, not being too pushy. But uh yeah, so it's like it's just slowly over time developing certain criteria, certain deal breakers, that that like, I won't settle in this or that way ever again. There are certain things that I can negotiate about. But for example, like if someone really wants to live with a partner and have babies with them or whatever, like I just automatically know that that's not me. And
Right.
there's nothing wrong with me or that person. It's just that like our needs just don't match. And I think that's another important thing, learning the difference between like, um, what's just a capacity difference versus actual like maybe values differences. Because like I don't have the capacity to be like someone's primary partner or something like that. That doesn't make them wrong for wanting a primary partner. That doesn't make me wrong for, not wanting that or having the capacity for that. So yeah, a lot of this is just over time figuring out what it is that brings you the most comfort and safety, that really tips you over that edge of not just like in survival mode, but you feel like you're actually thriving. You feel much more comfortable. You feel more confident. um like it's hard to explain, but it's almost like this levity in my chest, and it feels like it's attached
Mm.
to like the nervous system and
Mhm.
regulation and whatnot. um and like a lot of my therapy work has to do with like talking about the inner child and what does the inner child need,
Yeah.
what does it want. um and yeah. So I think it really boils down to just the figuring out your own criteria thing.
I see a lot of folks here on Zoom with us in the chat resonating with what you described, that the was it high standards and low expectations.
Mhm.
And I mean, that low expectations to me ties back to the default expectation a lot of us have of the relationship escalator and all of the other pieces of prescriptive patriarchal monogamy that we just kind of autopilot towards. And I think being able to let go of those expectations, it opens up that space for play.
Oh yeah.
And play in itself is so healing, right? Because like
Mhm.
one of the things that I've been working with in my own journey is like how much play settles my nervous system. Like if I can get to that space of playfulness, I know my nervous system is doing great. My nervous system has experienced resilience, and in a state of play, I can experience adversity. I can experience conflict with somebody where it's like, oh, you want to do that activity and I want to do this other activity, right? That's conflict. But when it's play, it's like, well, okay, let's explore. Let's see what happens. Because and like you said, there's high standards of like, you have to be tall enough to ride, you have to meet a certain level of self-awareness or experience or openness or whatever that is. And I think that's going to be different for each person. And I know for me, it's changed over time. But I really love that juxtaposition of high standards, low expectations, because that feels like a really, I love those little phrases where it's like, okay, this is easy for me to remember and just repeat to myself as a reminder as I go and explore. Um, and thank you for sharing all of that. We're coming up to the half hour. So is there anything else you want to add in to share with folks here today, Michelle?
I mean, no, I mean, I think we covered a good amount in this half hour, and just that, like, a reminder to people that like all these labels are, like, bringing up my 4-year piece of paper here, like labels and words are what we do to approximate experience, approximate reality. And language by nature is metaphorical. So
Mhm.
you might not ever find a label that 100% resonates with you and your experience. And that's totally fine. You can use these labels, you can try them on. If they don't fit, you know, discard them. And that's totally okay. And you don't have to fall under like, 100% criteria for every identity or label in order to, use them for yourself. And also, like, sometimes it is a phase, and there isn't anything wrong with that, because life is a bunch of phases. We start out as babies, we don't die as babies. I mean,
Yeah.
ideally. And like, yeah, so the solo polyamory thing, again, for myself, it seems to be what, is good for my life for now. And, later on in my life, I will probably almost certainly want something different. And yeah, a large part of exploring non-monogamy is, in my opinion, just freeing ourselves from the binds of a lot of the kind of arbitrary norms that have been set for us. Like, we can do a lot of things a la carte,
Mhm.
and yeah, it's just been incredibly liberating realizing that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michelle. It's been such a delight chatting with you today. And if folks want to find you, they can find you on Instagram at Polyamorous While Asian. And do you have any other platforms where you post or share your things?
I'm not one of those like multi-platform people. I don't have the capacity for that. Like, just keep keeping with this like capacity thing. But yeah, I mostly live on Instagram. If I ever do like post to the feeds, I will create like a version on my website, polyamorouswhileasian.com, so that you don't have to just find that information on Instagram.
Awesome. Thank you, Michelle. I really appreciate your time today.
Thank you. It was great. It was great chatting with you.
Ciao. I'm going to unspotlight and mute. And I'm going to bring our next guest on in a second here. I'm really enjoying all the conversation that's happening in the Zoom chat. And I just want to acknowledge there was a question about reading materials around polyamory. And just to kind of throw that out there, we don't have a whole lot of materials that are more about solo polyamory. A lot of non-monogamous material to date has really focused on more like people opening up from the space of being a couple, or people exploring, well, basically, yeah, it mostly comes from a space of opening up from being a couple, let's be honest. And, there's some materials that are definitely applicable. Like I think of books like Polysecure, absolutely applicable into solo polyamorous relationships, but it still comes from more of a couple-centric lens. So there's a need for more of that in the community. I'm working on my first book, but it might be a couple of years before that's out. So if you know of materials, or there are written materials or podcasts that you as a solo polyamorist have found to be particularly supportive and useful for you, please do pop them in the chat as a reference. If you're watching on the live stream, you can pop them into the chats there on the live stream too. And stepping off the relationship escalator. I think that is the one that we have about solo polyamory. So that was written by Amy Garhan, who was one of the co-founders of the solo polyamory group. You can also check out her blog, solopoly.net. I'm not sure how much she posts on there these days, but there's a lot of really, really good material there. All right, moving on. Roy, are you here? Yes, you are. I see you there. I'm going to add your pin onto the screen, and I will invite you to unmute. So welcome, Roy. So Roy, I'll invite you to introduce yourself in a second, but you've been a member of the Solo Polyamorous group on Facebook for a number of years, I think now. And you also are one of the folks talking about non-monogamy on social media. You have your Instagram, Open Relating, and you're very active and involved in building community as well, even outside of your practice. As I can't remember if you're a coach or a counselor. You're going to have to remind me of that. But we initially chatted because I filled out one of your research surveys, and then we keep sort of bumping into each other in different like polyamorous activist spaces. And so yeah, I'm really excited to have you here and to chat today. So Roy, would you like to introduce yourself a little bit more to folks here?
Hello, hi, good to be here. So my practice is called Open Relating for my coaching business, but I'm also a counselor. So I started counseling about a year and a half ago and got my license this past July. So I'm setting up a counseling therapy practice in London, where I'm mostly seeing people who are somewhere along their non-monogamous journey, but that's not the main thing they're coming about. But it just helps that they have a counselor that's very accepting of who they are, and see them for who they are. My coaching work involves guiding people through various hiccups and challenges, and sometimes big stumbling blocks, along that non-monogamous journey. And I work with individuals, with couples, triads, different varieties of partnerships. And as you mentioned, I post on social media. I also keep a blog that I try to keep kind of updated and write whenever I think of something to write. But it's it's kind of sporadic and whenever I feel inspired. I'm also living in London, UK. I don't know if I'm the only European person you have today, but love to bring a more European perspective on things as well. And here in London, we do have a community, which is great. For me, it was a big part of normalizing being polyamorous for myself, is finding community. and I wanted to kind of give back. And now I admin the London Polyamory Facebook and Telegram groups, and try to organize some in-person socials now and again. And also do a bunch of other things. I run some play fighting workshops and teach consent and boundaries in workshops. So yeah, I think that's me mostly.
You got a full plate there.
Mm.
And so what in all of this, like, what does your relationship landscape look like?
Well, I've been through quite a few iterations of non-monogamy over the last 10 plus years. Started with open relationship and moved into more kind of nesting polyamory, kind of with a hierarchy that was very unconscious and not really talked about, And I think that was like at the heart of the root of the issues we ended up having, is that I probably didn't really want to be in a nesting hierarchical polyamory, but I just didn't know any better and thought, well, that is still looks a little bit more like monogamy. So, maybe that's the easier option. And also that's what my partner wanted. And I didn't have the language to really challenge that and figure out what I want. I didn't have a clear understanding of my needs and my boundaries. So when that ended, and possibly because it ended quite badly in the way that we kind of ended things, I told myself I don't really want to live with anybody for a while. And I think that was the start of finding solo polyamory as a concept, right? It's like, okay, actually, I want to live on my own. And I feel like I have my freedom, feel like I have full autonomy, agency, but I still want to be partnered. I still want to have relationships. I still love falling in love. I love being committed to partners. I love that closeness and intimacy. So I didn't really want to give that up. And really it was finding a totally different way of relating that gives you that while maintaining that independence, right?
Yeah.
So, and because I was already writing, so at the time I was working in a very different field when that started. I was in tourism marketing, right? So very, very different. So for me, the process was really just organically meeting people that I wanted to date and being very honest about, I don't actually plan on living with anybody. I like my freedom. I don't want to be in a place where I have to ask anybody for permission, right? I'm very much about open and very honest communicating about things, about checking in with each other, but not about asking for permission, right? I'm an autonomous being, and that for me is very important. And the people that I was interested in and were interested in me were very on board with that. I was like, okay, that's very clear. I know where I'm standing, and that sounds like also what I want. So we'll have a go at it. And I think that I was very lucky to then start dating two people at the same time that were pretty much on board with the same values. And from there, I started exploring a bit more and found out about solo polyamory and understood, okay, there's a name for this, for what we're doing. At the moment, I am seeing 4 partners in London, and I have some more distant connections with people in Berlin and other places where it's not necessarily defined in any way. We don't have labels for it, but it's a good emotionally close connection.
Mm-hmm. Lovely. And so how long would you say the solo polyamory has been part of your journey now?
I'd say now it's 5 years.
5 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. And I think what you shared is what I think is a very common origin story for many of us, of like embarking into non-monogamy and just accidentally defaulting, autopiloting into something that feels hierarchical, because that's what we know in monogamy, right? And that has been, I call it the polynormative model, because that is what so much of the literature presents. And it is such a revelation, I think, for many people to be like, actually, I don't want to live with somebody. I want to like reclaim that agency and autonomy in myself. And I'm curious, from your insight both as a coach and as a counselor and as someone living solo polyamory, what has that journey been in terms of like reclaiming that agency? And I'm just going to know, I see a question in the Zoom and we'll come to that after this.
Well, so I think that what I've experienced in the nesting relationship, which was, as I mentioned, like kind of primary or hierarchical by default, not because we intentionally and consciously decided to do it, and that speaks to that question as well. You can nest with somebody, I believe, and still be solo polyamorous. It takes a lot of very, very conscious communicating and like knowing your boundaries and being very clear about the way you engage with each other, right? But it's possible, but it's not that, I guess, common. For me, that experience of walking on eggshells, because I just could not know how my partner at the time would react for me bringing up, say, wanting to date somebody else or developing a deeper connection with somebody else, not really understanding, like not knowing what are really the kind of the ground rules in a way, led me to crave more freedom. But I always wanted more freedom. And I think the issue in that relationship was that I kept challenging this desire to put boundaries and kind of put rules in place, because it clashed with my desire for freedom. So for me, that is a basic need. I see it as Maslow's kind of hierarchy of needs and things like that. There's when we get to the place of actualization, then we really need to be clear on what our values are. And for me, freedom, independence is like a super value, right? And out of that comes a lot more, because when I feel free, I also feel safer. And I feel I can give more to others, right? When I'm not being restricted, I'm a lot more open to give and to connect. So being free doesn't mean I have to just, do everything and just go wild, but knowing that I'm free gives me that sense of security. And I think that's what brought me to solo polyamory, and that's what keeps me there, because I therefore, when I connect with people and I make clear that these are my values, people don't expect that it will change. Like I'm very, very, very clear about it, and I look for people who share that. And they don't necessarily have to be solo polyamorous, but I think the key is that they want this for me, right? And I want freedom for them. Yeah,
I love that. And yeah, we don't have to just stick with dating other people who are solo polyamorous. Like I right now, one of my closest partners is someone who's in a nesting relationship. She identifies more as a relationship anarchist and exploring non-hierarchical polyamory. And we definitely have very different approaches to things. Like, she has more, I think, agreements fleshed out with some of her other partners. But for me, I'm like, I feel similar to you. Like, I'm like, agreements are okay, but like rules in relationships have never felt good to me. And I sometimes wonder if that's my own trauma response, and like, if that is okay. I think it is. That, coming out of a relationship that felt very restrictive of me, where I didn't have that freedom and agency and autonomy. Such a huge part of solo polyamory for me has been to reclaim that agency and autonomy. And I love what you said about like, what matters to you is that your partners want that for you, that they want to support and celebrate that freedom and agency. And yeah, I see Roz jumping in with this as well. The resonance with the idea of freedom making me feel safer. Like, as you said that, Roy, I felt that in my body. I could feel that, like, it really does. Like, my whole nervous system settles when I know that I have that freedom. And sometimes it's hard to pinpoint where or how that freedom starts to sort of evaporate, but you can feel it in your body, because your body or at least for me, my body starts to get tense, and I start to become more vigilant and squirrely about things, because I'm not feeling as safe.
Yeah. And I think that this doesn't mean that we get to do whatever we want without considering anybody else, right? It's not about being an asshole. The communication that's required to make this a healthy dynamic within multiple relationships, I think boils down to really seeing my partner as well, and hearing what they say, and not trying to create stories in my head and like read between the lines, but just be very clear about, like, this is what you're saying me, I accept that. Like, my partner can express anxiety about me connecting to maybe a lot of new partners, and have this fear that she'll get less time with me, for example. right? And this is a true story. But the thing is that she then also tells me, I don't want you to change. I don't want you to do anything you don't want to do, or I don't want you to do anything just for me. I'm just telling you I'm experiencing this anxiety or this fear, and I just want to know that you're seeing me. And I feel that, and it's really important that she also says that, because my immediate kind of like people pleaser part will be like, oh, am I doing something that's like upsetting to her, and should I then change? So it's really helpful to hear, no, I don't want you to change. I'm just like processing this anxiety right now. And what I want to know is that our relationship won't suffer, won't like be harmed by your other connections, for example. And that is on me to navigate. Yeah.
And it really strikes me that that level of communication in a relationship, that can take work to get to that place, because we do all have that like inner people pleaser part of ourselves. We're so used to the monogamous conditioning around we have to abandon our agency for the sake of our partnerships. And so overcoming that is a journey. It is kind of its own process. Yeah, I'm curious, like, what do you think helps people get to that place where like you can confidently know that everyone in a relationship is being open and freely expressed? Because I think of experiences in my relationship past where it's like, I thought we were doing that. And it turns out somebody wasn't. Sometimes that person was me. But so how can people work on that skill? How do you know that you are actually really being openly expressed about it?
Yeah. I think it's this ability to hear really difficult things or things that you don't particularly like to hear, and then react in a way that makes it safe for your partner to keep sharing, to keep opening up, and to keep doing that, right? If I respond in a way that matches their anticipation of somebody shutting them down or rejecting them, something that ties up to an old wound or a trauma of not being heard or not being, then that will reinforce that story. If I can change that pattern, this is part of healing, in co-regulation that happens in relationships, and that's whether it's monogamy or polyamory, it's the same thing, right? Like it's not our job to heal our partner, that's what therapists or group work or self-work is for, but we can be part of this process.
Yeah.
And we're doing it by really wanting to see our partner be their full selves, and even with parts that we may not like, right? So how I react to this is super important, because that will set the tone of whether they'll open up to me again. And same in reverse. So if I can listen to something and recognize that I'm triggered or activated, but before I respond, just like pay attention that I am activated, find a way to deal with that first, right? And only then respond, then I think that's a big part of the process. Yeah.
The word that comes up for me is titration. And that comes from my somatic experiencing training, where like we slow down the experience so that we can actually connect to what we're experiencing. And what you're describing, like if I feel activated, if I feel triggered, being able to just take that step back and address that in myself before I respond, so that I know I'm coming from a clear place. That's so valuable and not always easy to do.
No, and I can't say that I always do it, but I keep striving for it, yeah.
Like I know something that I will recommend to my clients is like, if you're in that tense moment, take a 20-minute timeout. Like literally set a timer for 20 minutes, go for a run, go for a walk, go lie down, roll around on the floor, whatever you need to do, scream into a pillow, and then come back. Because it takes 20 minutes sometimes for our nervous system to just process a single experience of activation. And the spaciousness that we can cultivate in our relationships when we give ourselves the grace to have those pauses where we aren't like pushing through to get it resolved immediately. Because I think that's one of those other things that comes from mononormative stuff of like, we need to resolve this now, because if there's any conflict, then our relationship must be over, right? That's the catastrophizing brain that comes in.
Yeah. So I do find that solo polyamory has given me, when I kind of first started on that process, the time and space to really heal from a traumatic relationship.
Yeah.
And I actually come back to what it is that I need and where do I place my boundaries. So in new relationships, I can communicate that so much better now. And I know what baseline safety now feels like. And that's really thanks to I think choosing solo polyamory. And I think as I think Michelle said before, like it doesn't mean that it's always going to be the case. I personally feel that it's pretty much who I am, but also I also know that life is always about change, right? And transformation. But even for people who are not necessarily maybe naturally or by orientation solo polyamorous, it can be an amazing experience, I think, to focus on yourself in this way, prioritize your needs while not denying having relationships and continuing also on building intimacy with people. Even if it's not going to be forever, it can be very healing, and it can be a great way to understand what does autonomy, what does agency really feel like. So if you then go into a primary relationship with somebody, you can actually say, well, in this relationship, these are the things that for me are important, and I don't want to compromise on them, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't believe relationship, even if it's a primary relationship, is about compromise. Compromise is still giving up some of your needs.
Yeah.
So it's really about collaborating together to find a way that you can both meet your needs fully, and that's what makes a relationship awesome. So.
And I know a lot of people who've been part of the solo polyamorous community who have transitioned away from solo polyamory. And as you just described, like they're able to find themselves in a primary relationship. Like we had Mislav at the beginning of this morning, who was one of the original moderators of the group. And, you know, he didn't mention it there. I think he'll be okay with me mentioning it now. Like he now has a nesting partner. He is in something that's more primary-like. But, you know, for people like him, that journey through solo polyamory has given them that strength in self-relationship to be able to go into something more primary like without losing their agency, without losing themselves in there. And I think that's so valuable a practice. And Michelle noted on this, you know, that the practices we have here, that these are good relationship practices. Like it's good for any kind of relating. And yeah, that ability to have our agency and be in connection at the same time. I see some folks in the Zoom chat resonating. Yeah, Roz says collaborate and not compromise is more of how I try to navigate conflicts and connections. And Christina also resonating with to collaborate and not compromise. And that to me ties into like the definition of consent. Like, you know, when people talk about consensual non-monogamy, I for a long time resisted that label because so many people talk about consent as like seeking permission. Well, like I have permission from my primary partner to date outside, that kind of thing. But consent is more about collaboration than it is about permission for me these days. And that idea that, you know, if we are collaborating on this, we are in a state of consent, and it's a dynamic thing that we are continuously exploring. There is no complacency in this.
Yeah, and this is why I find that for my relationships, what works best is to have as few agreements as possible, because what we do have is this framework of honesty, communication, and compassion, and wanting my partners to be fully informed so they can make decisions for themselves and be autonomous, right? Yeah. And when you have that, you don't really need agreements. You just, you know, you have this basic respect. And when I do things, I do consider, is my partner is going to be affected by that? And what do I need to do to make sure that they can have informed consent, right?
Yeah, and I feel like for me, agreements have come in more as like temporary pieces if there's going to be shared space or there's specific events happening and there are specific needs around things. But I do resonate with what you're saying about, you know, if we understand what our partner's needs are and what our partner's desires are and boundaries, and we understand that in ourselves too, there's a natural space of unfolding of, right, this is the sandbox that we play in. And yeah. There's so much freedom in that.
Yeah. I had a question from a follower on Instagram, and I wanted to forward it in here as well and see if other people have suggestions. And I think it's a good general question, which is, if you're going on a date, how do I identify somebody who would kind of match you on these values of solo polyamory? How can you identify a solo polyamorous person on the first meeting? And kind of what questions would you ask? Because they may not know that they're solo polyamorous, but actually embody those values, right?
Yeah. And I am fairly certain, this is going to be me tooting my own horn here, which I do not do often. I'm fairly certain that one of the reasons Vancouver became such a hot spot for solo polyamory is that I went on so many dates with people in my first couple of years, and nobody knew what it was, and I would just articulate it over and over and over again, and then introduce people to the term.
Mhm.
And I'm sure that then that like osmosis kind of spread.
Yeah.
But I think this is a great question. How do you tell that someone's solo polyamorous? So how do you articulate that? So those of you who've joined on Zoom, I want to invite you to just pop your ideas for that into the chat. And if you're on the live stream, you can pop your ideas into the comments there.
Yeah, and I think that actually just bringing it up first and seeing what the reaction is and how curious they are and what questions they ask is a good way to start. But paying attention to what they talk about in regards to how much personal time and space do they need, what do they do for themselves, like what kind of enrichment and hobbies and interests they have. I think it can be a good indication of whether they're at least be compatible. They may not necessarily need to be solo polyamorous themselves, as we mentioned before, but if they're compatible with that, that means that they're encouraging you to have your own space and prioritize your needs as well, because that's something that they do for themselves.
Something that comes to mind for me is this was a thread recently in the Facebook group. Somebody was cluing into the we language that a potential partner was using. And I think that is something I pay attention to, is when I am getting to know somebody, how much are they using we language versus I language? Because that we language is a bit of a whistle for they have some kind of enmeshed, their identity is merged with their partner, which may be great. And like that, if that works for them, fabulous. But that may indicate some possible challenges down the road for us. I like this suggestion from Nancy. When you set a boundary, how do you expect it to be enacted?
Well, the boundary is something that I enact for myself, right? So I'm not expecting anybody else to look after that boundary. It's my responsibility. And in that sense, if I feel that somebody is doing something that goes against it, I need to basically be aware of that and just say something, take myself out of the situation. Extreme case, break up the relationship, but it is kind of totally up to me.
Yeah.
And that's, I think often people get that confused with rules or with putting a limit on somebody else. And I know that, but there's a lot of information now out there online about what a boundary really is. And that's really important as a baseline to kind of get that. And then things get easier when you realize that you have the power to enact and protect your own boundaries.
And I think it is a great question to ask people on a what I would call a date zero, where it's like, so, how do you have, what's your relationship to your boundaries? I like asking the open-ended questions to kind of see where people take them. Roz shared in the chat. So yeah, again, this is responding to like, how do you screen people? I think you share your story about how and what you've learned about relating and what matters to you in dating. And then you see how they respond and what they share about their own story as a follow-up. So my first dates are often this exchange of our stories. Yeah, I like doing that too.
And suggestions, yeah. Cool.
Lauren says that's one of the most beautiful things about being solo, trusting my empathy and compassion and knowing I can uphold my boundaries. Yes, wonderful. So we're coming up to the top of the hour here, Roy. Thank you so much for being here. I so appreciate your shares and your wisdom and your ability to articulate these things as well. If folks want to connect with you, find out more about your work, how can they find you?
So the easiest thing is to go to my website, openrelating.love. And there's a blog there with lots of articles. There are videos and podcasts, as well as the opportunity to book a session with me, first free session for coaching or counseling. And then on Instagram and Threads now, I am Open Relating.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, Roy. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.
am going to mute you and unpin you. And we'll get ready for our next guest. I'm really loving all the conversation that's been happening here in the Zoom chat. Thank you all for your shares and your reflections. And, something that came up for me in that conversation as well is like, I don't know if you all resonate with this, but I know I would be a terrible cult leader because I am always with my partners. I'm like, no, what do you want? Like, don't just go along with this because it's what I want to do. What would you like to do? Um, and and I think that as solo polyamorous, we do kind of encourage that culture of freedom and autonomy and choice around us in so many ways. And there's also sometimes a grief with that, isn't there? Of like, I want you to be autonomous and have your own choice and have your freedom. And that might mean that I don't get my need met, or I have an unmet desire in this relationship. And then, you know, that takes us down the rabbit hole of how do we navigate that piece in ourselves and really honor where everybody is at. So our next guest coming up here is, where are you? I saw you there, Nancy. I'm gonna add your pin and let me see about, I'm gonna make you co-host because I know that you have some things to share, and we'll invite you to unmute. So hi, Nancy.
Hi, Mel.
I'm so
So
thrilled to have you here. Like,
I
we have chatted
know.
online so much, but this is the first time we're like face to face and like seeing each
Yeah.
other's expressions and hearing each other's voice.
I'm thrilled. Yeah, it's so great.
So Nancy has been a member of the solo polyamory community for a long time. Like I can't remember when you joined the group, but I feel like you're one of those people who's just like always been there. And you have brought a wealth of wisdom and compassion to the group and to those conversations. And then I sometimes run into you in other spaces because we're both involved in dance and intentional community kind of things on the West
Yeah.
Coast. So I see Nancy's name pop up in other places and I'm like, Nancy. So Nancy, I'm going to invite you to introduce yourself, and then I'm going to step off and hand you the reins
Okay.
for a moment so I can take a little bit of a bio break for myself. So
Yay.
Nancy, it's over to you.
Great. Thanks, Mel. I'm Nancy Shanto. I live in the ancestral homelands of the Nishanan. I live in the Sierra foothills of California, and I'm practicing rural solo polyamory, as well as I'm a relationship anarchist and queer. My journey into solo polyamory started out with open relating that turned in, I started exploring relationship anarchy first. And then I realized solo polyamory was a great description for what I was doing. And I also really resonated with how the solo polyamory group functions. I felt like the relationship anarchy group was really expressing a lot of problems that the solo polyamory group seemed to have solved. And for me, one of the things I wanted to talk about today is the way in which we create cultures through these identity labels. And the culture that we're creating is something that if we consciously set it, it makes a big impact on what results we get. And if we know that we're engaging with culture, then we can ask questions and relate in respectful ways with each other's cultures. So I try to remember when somebody is telling me that I'm doing something wrong, that they're probably telling me that from a different culture. And instead of getting defensive, I can get curious about that. I did prepare a presentation because I'm going to talk about what we do with solo polyamory when we're relating with people who are either married or in a primary partnership that they're stating as a primary partnership. So they don't necessarily bring the same values to relationships that we do. And oftentimes, even if we say, are you non-hierarchical, they'll say yes, and then have all these hierarchical activities that they're doing. And so I wanted to just give some support for how to do that. And I'm going to share my screen. And I'm open to, if people ask questions or want me to stop sharing my screen and talk, to have a dialogue. I love those kinds of moments as well. And I'm so glad Mel's getting a break. Yeah, that's important. All right, let's see. Uh-oh. I don't know if I can, I'm not seeing the right screen to share. Hmm.
I'm still here. You are co-host, aren't you?
Oh, there it is. I got
Okay.
it.
Cool.
Okay, great. So this is my topic, solo boundaries when relating with married and primary partnered folks. And I just wanted to start out by saying that I think of boundaries more as space, property ownership, and all of the ways in which we protect land boundaries has informed how people think about boundaries, I think. And we can end up thinking of boundaries as lines or walls or fences or legal protections, of rules that will protect us from other people's behavior. And I think in solo autonomous relating models, we can tend to end up being set up for failure right away when we think about boundaries in that way. I like to invite us to think about boundaries as space. So do we have enough space to speak, to choose, to coexist, to move our bodies toward and away from what we want? And when we can't move our bodies, to express our autonomy in such a way that it gets honored. Let me just make sure I can see the chat. I always have to do this thing where I rearrange my whole screen when I'm presenting. Thanks for your patience. All right, so when we're talking about relational structures, I think of marriage as a relational structure. The Polyamory podcast, they did a little research and found that 6,000 to 9,000 benefits get conveyed to relationships that through marriage, depending on the state in the United States. So this is a United States statistic. So 6,000 to 9,000 legal benefits are getting conveyed by marital structure. And obviously we're not getting those kinds of benefits when we're primary or nesting partners. We are getting some benefits from just the relational structure that we operate within. And when we're in solo polyamory, and if we're operating without those benefits, oftentimes there's going to be a clash between our expectations for how things will go. One of the big clashes I tend to see is that people who are in some way entangled in their relationships may not already have ownership of their time. They may have to check with the other person about how they make commitments. Whereas we tend to, in solo relationships, already have our own time to be ours. So there's nobody to check with when we're making commitments. So that's an example of something that can kind of end up being a default assumption based on the relational structure. I'm definitely talking about hierarchical relationship structures as the boundaries in this particular presentation. I can talk about all kinds of boundaries, though. That's one of the things that I like to talk about all the time. How do we do autonomy in a way that works with other people? So the kinds of normative relational assumptions that can come up are people making rules for their relationship, and they think they're making rules for themselves, but it ends up touching onto other people's relationships. So somebody might have a mononormative assumption about how relationships should work, and they can end up imposing limits and controls on either their partner, I call that the hinge in this situation, or a third party, the non-partner. Otherwise, we often use the word meta or metamorph for that. And a no overnights rule, for example, would be something when people are opening up, they might say, I'm used to getting you to sleep next to me all the time, and I don't want to lose that when we open up. So I'm going to say no overnights. And that ends up limiting how many relational options somebody else has in their relationship with you. Vetoes, we talk about vetoes a lot as when somebody says, I will threaten to leave if you date that person, or if you relate with that person, or if your relationship is more than casual. If the primary relationship gets to be at risk, we're going to close our relationship and rebuild our connection. So now I'm not relating with you anymore. And these kinds of things are very also amatonormative. This escalation or elevation of sexual and romantic relational forms being more important than friendship or community relationships, family relationships. It can turn into control, where members of one relationship decide how third-party relationships will progress. Timelines for developing intimacy or allowable activities. They might limit holidays or vacations or public displays of affection. Something like, we can't have sex until the third date because my partner's threatened by my new sexual activity. So, and finally, I kind of was thinking about this the other night, and I called this spillover. It's not necessarily a word I see in the community, but this idea that one relationship's status in terms of the energy that is happening in it could spill over into other relationships and cause problems in the other relationships. So when conflict in one relationship limits activities in another, when dates will get canceled, or there's a lack of privacy for third parties, triangulation, some kind of internet behavior such as stalking, requiring meetings, requiring people to leave a parallel dynamic or to join a kitchen table poly dynamic. The quote I put here was, somebody wants you to delete that picture you posted of us because you're not allowed to be public in our relationship, whereas this other relationship is very public. It's the public one. Am I going too fast? It's very weird to be like speaking into an echo chamber. Thanks, Roz. I appreciate this was Friday night at, late when I was writing all this. So your solo boundaries are expressions of your yes and no. And so I put a bunch of things that we in our culture tend to communicate as things we don't want, such as couples privilege or sneakyarchy. That's Amy Garen's word for it. Unicorn hunting, where a couple will try and date an ideal third, and then try polyfidelity is when they would then say, you're only dating us and you're not allowed to date anyone else. Now that we found you, we're a throuple and you're not allowed to see anyone else. But you're not allowed to do everything that we get to do either. Those kinds of couples privilege things where this third party is like an appendage to the relationship, and it's not necessarily a full partnership. One penis policy where the gender of other partners is controlled. Relationship escalator being that once we decide we're going to date, then we go through a whole sequence of activities that build up towards living together, getting married, having children, dying together. That this relationship escalator is only allowed to progress in one direction. You can't go back and transition into a different form. And also creating fixed structures that are not allowed to change, such as a triad or a quad, where people aren't, they're only supposed to relate together. One of the things I've seen is that people say, you can't even message each other without me. We only are allowed to message each other in a group chat. And the yes is that most of I see in our culture of solo polyamory that we're saying yes to body autonomy, that I get to control what I do with my body, and it's my choice, and I don't have to inform anybody ahead of time about what I'm going to do with my body. I will, protect your body autonomy, and I'll let you know what I've done with my body so that you can protect your body. But I'm not necessarily going to let you tell me what to do with my body. Choice-based relating instead of role-based relating. So instead of now you're my girlfriend or boyfriend or partner or husband or wife or your spouse, that these roles then dictate what you do in your relationship with me. I would like to be in a relationship that is based on the choices that we make, what we want. I often talk about 100% of what I want and 100% of what you want are your own little Venn diagram circles. And the space that crosses over is our cooperative playground. And if we only do things that are in our crossover space with each other, then we're in our yes relationship. Sometimes I might be willing to do something that's not in my 100%, but it's in your 100% because I don't have a problem with it. We really want to watch out for those slippery slope resentments. I think it was it was Michelle who was talking about resentments building up between partners. And when we do things we don't want to do. We're looking for equity versus equality and non-coercion. That means I'm not trying to control you and you're not trying to control me. And equity being, we don't necessarily need to have equal things across our relationships. We can customize our commitments with different people, One of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately is progressive trust. That I was in a situation where I had a long-term solo polyamorous relationship that had been going on. There's a lot of trust. And then I started relating with somebody new, and that person wanted to just turn on all of the things that I had with this other longer term partner in order to get equality. And it was almost like if you do that with that person, you're not doing it with me, I'm insecure. And there was this sense of, even I was using couples privilege against them, and they hadn't earned the trust yet. So how do we actually say, this isn't off the table with you, but it is something that I'm not ready to do yet with you. I don't know you well enough yet. I was even thinking we could take the relationship anarchy smorgasbord and kind of say, this is available as a potential, but it's not unlocked yet. And even I unlock a little bit of it, but it's not all the way unlocked yet, because we're building trust together. We're getting to know each other. Let's get through some things together first before we actually, like, I'm not automatically going to make you medical power of attorney because this person who's been in my life for years is medical power of attorney. I might never want to make you medical power of attorney. I might only want to have sexy fun times with you, So being able to kind of customize the relationship and commitments. I know we talk about that a lot in relationship anarchy, but I really also thinking about how trust relates with the way we customize our commitments. Relational autonomy, I was thinking of as being no third parties are controlling other relationships. So nobody outside of my relationship controls my relationship. And then networks of aid and care, there's this way that when we start talking about solo polyamory as a form, we end up, and non-hierarchy, non-coercion, we end up beginning to think about, like, why am I only focusing on my romantic and sexual relationships? Why isn't my dearest friend or my community member who comes and watches my dog and takes out my trash, why am I talking about only these relationships as having intimacy or depth when there's this whole network of community aid and care that is a big part of my life? And maybe even my community is where I put more of my attention. Maybe my community is where I'm making more of my investments. So really starting to think about, how do we broaden our even idea of what we know. We're talking about solo. It's indicating like I'm solo in romantic and sexual ways, but am I solo in terms of my community? No. So oftentimes we end up having our labels define our identity in relationship with the norm, and trying to open up possibilities for other ways to describe what we're doing that create a different, like this queering that Mel was talking about at the beginning, a really different way of thinking about who we are and how we relate. And finally, this customized commitments, that we're operating in the cooperative playground. We're deciding what we're going to commit to each other and what we're not going to commit to each other. Sometimes it can be really a big relief to say, you don't ever have to worry about taking care of my house, taking care of my dog, whatever. Like, I will never ask you to do any of those things. Those can be really relieving as well. And this obviously there's way more than 3 positive outcomes to solo polyamory, but I was thinking of relationship independence, this relational autonomy idea, that the only people making decisions about a relationship are the people in that relationship. That there's a privacy and empowerment benefit that oftentimes people, when they're opening up, are very slow to get, that relationships are going to flourish in an environment of informed consent, which means I have enough information to say yes to something and to say no to something, that everyone has the information to make the decisions, and that people aren't overstepping into other people's privacy in order to get that information. And the art of being able to say, in my network, I'm dealing with X, without saying who you're dealing with that from, for example. And that was definitely something I learned in the context of relationship anarchy and solo polyamory practice, not to necessarily out somebody else's information that they had just given me, even when I'm trying to figure out what that means for me, to really take care of another person's information. And then progressive trust, this third idea that I'm thinking of, which is that things don't have to be equal to be equitable, that that equity is emerging from respect and care and compassion and our anti-oppression work and our authentic self-expression, that we're really uplifting each other's self-expression, and that trust is building over time through our shared understanding and experiences, and not something that we're going to get from a role in somebody's life. So I wanted to give you a list of questions. This question gets asked in the solo polyamory group all the time. And I think I missed some, I was doing this on Friday, so I missed some money entanglement questions here. And I'd love if you'd add questions that you're using as vetting questions to the chat. But these are ones that came to me off the top of my head. Things like, can you host? Because if somebody is not really able to share their space, are they getting a hotel room and being able to host in a hotel room? Are they only able to come over to your house because you're solo? And then you end up with all the work associated with that. Is that going to be good for you? Maybe you would like it if it was only at your house, but if the other person can host, it's really helpful to know that. If I'm in the hospital, will you visit me? What happens if there's an emergency at home while we're on a date? Can we go on vacations together? Are there special activities? This is kind of a trick question. Can we have special activities that are just for us? The reason it's a trick question is special activities that are protected activities often are a sign of hierarchy. And also the desire for special activities can often be a sign of people trying to get some security. So it's it can swing in both directions. Will you exchange gifts with me? Would you stop spending time with me if your partner asked you to? And can I post pictures of us on social media? Can I kiss you in public? Will you invite me to holiday celebrations and to meet your family? Can I see you on your birthday? And do you have flexibility with your schedule? So, sometimes people are like, I can only see somebody on Thursday nights. And if you can't see me on Thursday nights, we can't relate, because that's the only night I get to leave the house. That is a strong limit on the scope and change and growth available to our relationship if we were to relate. If you're relating with somebody, especially if you have tons of flexibility, it can end up being like, oh, you're the flexible one, so you should change all the time our dates or change your schedule to accommodate me. So please feel free, put all other questions that you have in the chat. I'd love to hear them. The question that Roy asked, I put the boundaries, how do you enact boundaries question. I think that would be a good one. Roz just added, is it okay for us to support each other financially if it's needed? I wouldn't personally ask this early on, but I have known money issues. Yeah, definitely. Money can be such a hot topic in solo situations. I only have a couple more slides, Mel. I'm almost done. I just wanted to remind us, our soloness can be such a gift. It's an expression of authentic prioritization of the relationship that we have with ourselves, where our time is our own, we have body autonomy and space autonomy. We're our own primary. We often value solitude, solo vacations, independent decision-making, and following our own flow. I have recently just started doing solo birthdays because I just really take great care of myself. And when I have to follow other people's flow, oftentimes I end up getting disappointed. So that can be, challenging. Solo doesn't have to mean casual or temporary or unserious, and it also might. There's no assumptions. The best way to find out who we are and what we want is to ask. And we're relating based on choice, so people don't get assigned roles in our life. We customize our commitments. Our friendships are often just as important as our romantic and social relationships. And of course, if you want to give somebody a role, that's your choice too. I just, as soon as we start giving roles, we're making assumptions. So I just wanted to remind us all, solo boundaries are embodied expressions of our relational values, desires, and preferences. They're not negotiable, though how we enact them might be. And as we protect our body, space, and choices with our words and actions, we get to surround ourselves with yeses. All right. I'm going to stop my share. Oh, here, if you want a screenshot, here's how to reach me. feel like I was talking too fast.
Nancy, that was amazing.
Thank you.
I only got to see some of the slides because I went and made myself a coffee, but that was phenomenal. Thank you so much. And I'm so glad we are recording this. Did you also do the recording for yourself
I
too?
didn't, because I just didn't.
Well, I've got it.
Yeah,
I feel like there was so much wisdom in there, and I see people also resonating with that, and so many great ideas of other questions. Like someone here said, do you have any power exchange dynamics that affect your polyamory practice? Oh, that's a good one to ask. And I'm looking at that list of questions going like, oh, there are so many situations where I wish I had asked those things ahead of time. And it really is one of those things where we just don't know what we don't know, right? We go into this going, oh, solo polyamory, this is great, agency, autonomy, blah, 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 blah. And then we run into the real life challenges of it. And we go, how do I handle this? Because there's nothing in that wealth of information about relationship theory and, how to save your marriage and how to find your soulmate in 10 days and all that, those kinds of materials where we're like, well, how do you date someone who's already got a primary partner, and how do you take care of yourself in that? Yeah, I see some people saying this presentation is exactly what I needed to see and hear. Yeah. Dan asked a question. I was wondering if you could talk more about the problems solved in SOPO that aren't yet solved in RA. You mentioned that at the beginning. I think that was in reference to the different Facebook groups. And, I don't want to throw shade at any groups, because I think the Relationship Anarchy Forum is a relationship anarchy forum. It has, it's very strong on its values. And yet the community culture in that space is definitely different from how it is in the solo polyamory Facebook group. So did you want to add anything to that?
I mean, I could just say that anarchists can often be so anti-rules that they end up with allowing treatment of other people that I would consider to be unacceptable. And the guardrails can be not there, and also who's doing the community care labor.
Yeah.
I found that in the solo polyamory group, that was incredibly excruciatingly clear. The mod rules were really clear. The conversation was being limited in order to create a high target. And we ended up with not a lot of messy posts as a result.
Yeah.
It's highly curated, whereas in the relationship anarchy group, and I also think it can happen in relationship anarchy relationships, the way that we can do intolerance of intolerance is can be very confusing.
Yeah.
And so I really I struggle with that in relationship anarchy spaces.
Same. What you're saying reminds me of, I just finished watching the Yellowstone 1923 series with Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren. That's the reason I watched the show, because it had Harrison Ford and Helen Mirren. And I mean, it's so interesting because to watch it as a relationship anarchist and solo polyamorous, and so much of the story is basically about libertarianism and that, throwing a finger to the government kind of mentality that I did not grow up around. Like, I'm so curious about all of that. And one of the things that Harrison Ford's character says in that, he's describing how and why government restrictions come in. And he makes some parallel about when they've studied other cultures. And it's like, within a certain number of people can be self-organizing. Under a certain number, we can be self-organizing, and we can navigate, like the farmers can decide, oh, well, we're going to plant the crops now, not later. But once you get above a certain number, it's hard to navigate that. And that's when you do need to have rules and guidelines and so forth come in. And I think this is one of the really interesting things that we explore as human beings who relate with one another, of where do we find that balance of allowing that agency and that autonomy for everybody. But when we come together in a space, how do we curate what that space is there for? Yeah.
Yep. I just big props to you, Mel. I know how much you shaped that.
Well, it's not just me, you know, it is a team, and we have Roz here, who's been
Roz, yeah.
present today, who's one of our mods, and Roz is going to speak later on. And you know, we've had an incredible team through the years, and
I saw Rosalind earlier too.
and I think that, like, you know, it's gonna go through another shift again soon. I'm sure, like, some of us are feeling like, oh, it's time for some new energy to come into the mod squad, but that's what happens, right? There is, someone else was saying earlier, like, change is the only constant, I think Roy said, and like that is part of the nature of it.
Yeah.
Thank you again so much, Nancy. So what we are going to do now, I'm going to unpin, and I'm going to remove you as co-host so you don't get stuck with all the admin things there. We are going to be going into a little bit of social time. So I'm going to be pausing the live